One of the big things that Part 108 did was drive an emphasis on safety management systems and their practical applicability to operations under those new rules, which in a lot of ways I think are going to allow for a more scalable and a more sustainable commercialized aspect of the industry.
Welcome back to the Unmanned Podcast powered by USI. Today we have a very special edition. We're going to talk about the new Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM, for Part 108. It's been years in the making. The entire industry is excited about this rule, and we have been unpacking it over the last few weeks, so you won't have to. But if you want, please follow along. The docket number and link will be in the info section below. Today, we have to discuss this. We've invited Josh Olds, the CEO of USI, back on, as well as two additional friends in Alex Mirot, the Director of Product for USI, and Rob Knochenhauer. He is the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Censys Technologies, the maker of Centero 5 and 6. We won't be able to dig into every nook and cranny of this rule, and I encourage you all to dig deep and comment on the proposal by clearly explaining the issue you have and, when possible, your solution. Look, we've been waiting this long for the rule. We shouldn't wait any longer to discuss. Let's go. Hello, everyone. Thanks for watching us today, and thanks for checking us out. We normally don't do this, but we have a super exciting and very new NPRM that just got released for Part 108. I'm sure everyone in the industry was waiting for this to happen, and it happened over the last week. We've been diligently pouring into it, unpacking it, and learning about it. We don't normally have these extra episodes, but we're excited about it, so we even named this one. This is called Beyond Visual Line of Sight, What Part 108 Could Mean for Training, Technology, and Drone Workforce. We have a couple of guests, which is also different. Josh Olds and Alex Mirot, who are co-founders of the Unmanned Safety Institute, USI. Alex is the head or director of product, and Josh the CEO. And also our friend Rob Knochenhauer, who's the director of regulatory affairs for Censys. If Part 107 let drones take off, Part 108 is going to let them fly further, safely, and more routinely. What are your initial thoughts on Part 107 and what they did here?
So I think when you look at 107, visual line of sight, I think what 108 is doing is it's expanding the use of emerging technology, drone technology, both from a size perspective, so size of the aircraft that could be flown, and then to your point, the range at which it can be flown. It's also introducing a lot of new nuances to operating aircraft within the national airspace, which, again, as an aviation nerd, is pretty exciting. And then at the same time, it's also introducing, I think, a lot of unknowns or maybe ambiguity behind what is operations going to look like in different industry clusters as we move forward into rules.
Yeah, Alex, what's your thoughts, your initial kind of take or look once you read it?
It's been a long time. 2016, 107 came out, and I think people were really excited about that and thought this is going to really open up industry. And what we kind of found out quickly was that we were limited on the scope of type of operations we were doing. And then waivers came around and they allowed us to do a little bit more. And this has the potential for really opening up some operations that really make sense financially for companies. And give us scale. And so it is exciting that this could happen. And it's also, I'm cautiously optimistic because of the timetables, the difference between 107 and 108. I do think that this is going to be a net positive for the industry. But, we've seen this movie before.
And Rob, your take is going to be unique too, I think, from the perspective of working in a manufacturer and as an OEM representative. What's your initial take of the 108?
My initial take is that it's a move for everybody to have more equitable access to these capabilities that have been really difficult to obtain under waivers and exemptions. Not impossible. I mean, certainly a number of folks have had the tenacity to go about, building their safety cases and getting those conversations with the FAA to get their waivers approved under Part 107 or exemptions under Part 91. And I think what's exciting about this is that now this is, leveraging a lot of the lessons learned from the waivers and exemptions that have been published over the years to actually to be put together, like I think the commonalities of a lot of these previous approvals, and to come up with a way to make it accessible to more operators that are seeking to do these complex type of operations. So I'm excited for it, but it's a very different animal than Part 107.
Yeah, that's for sure. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but I feel like 107 was like 60 pages and this is 720 pages. So it's very, very different in size and scope, and the ability to digest this all for most folks is almost overwhelming. So I hope today's episode helps the audience just get a good feel of what the differences between 107 and 108 are, how it will help, like Rob said, expand the capabilities for BVLOS flights, and as Josh and Alex both talked about, help enhance training and workplace development work. So kind of focusing on those, let's start with the training aspect and just quickly, how do we see this standardized BVLOS rule under 108 change that workforce demand that we had in the ad hoc 107 world? How does that transform? What do you see there, Alex or Josh?
In 107, the FAA actually had a requirement, and that was for that general knowledge exam be accomplished prior to operating. There was no skill set required, although there were some industry organizations that were suggesting them. And so for us, it was, doing this for the time we've been doing it, it was a need to have the Part 107 remote pilot certificate, and then you had a nice to have, which was the training, and we were kind of making the argument that would improve safety and efficiency. This is kind of 108 turns that on its head, where it actually makes requirements, and it says that there's multiple crew positions that are out there, and these crew positions, it goes as far as mandating topics that they need to learn. It has a general knowledge piece, and then it has a make and model specific skill set that you need. And so it's taking training very serious. That's closer to what we see in the traditional aviation world, which is good for us at USI. That's what we believe in. And so there's a training requirement now that wasn't there really before. And so that's a nice foundation, and then we want to augment that.
One item I'd add that, again, to Alex's point, is exciting as, Unmanned Safety Institute is really looking at the importance that they're driving to safety management systems. This has been something that, again, from a USI perspective, we're teaching, we're educating. It's part of our workforce. Really core values is the development of that safety culture within an organization. There's so many different mental models inside of the emerging tech industry, from technology to DoD to the aviation industry to the hobbyist recreational. So you get a lot of clashing of cultures, I'll say, when it comes to what does safety mean, what does safety management system in the practices that are deployed look like. So I think one of the big things that Part 108 did was drive an emphasis on safety management systems and their practical applicability to operations under those new rules, which in a lot of ways I think are going to allow for a more scalable and a more sustainable commercialized aspect of the industry.
Yeah, I agree. And Rob, from the perspective of, and for those of you who are watching that may not know, Rob is the Director of Regulatory Affairs for Censys, which make the Centero 5 and Centero 6, which are BVLOS aircraft. What I want to know from you as a stakeholder in 108 is, what do you see the greatest use cases for this new rule? Do you see an immediate or a quicker viability to operations with this new 108 framework?
Not exactly. I mean, I think it's, there is enough requirements that are in the rule that there's going to be a learning curve. So for any operators that are to come into it, even like operators that we work with currently who are currently conducting BVLOS operations under waivers to Part 107, where some of the training requirements that have been outlined, we have also required in the safety case development that we put in front of the FAA for conducting BVLOS operations. And so in that regard, there's already kind of a defined process that we've been following that has been approved. And, I think there's going to be some carryover and ideally some expansion of the approvals that we have currently. Our aircraft right now is pretty well leveraged in what it can accomplish beyond visual line of sight at a hardware level. So for an operations under a rule just allows us to kind of formalize what we can do in a way without having to build those safety cases for ourselves or for our clients. But there is going to have to there's a required focus on really specifications of the training, specifications of how we manage our aircraft, and how we manage the operations in ways that we really haven't had to define as clearly as is going to be outlined in Part 108. So while I think ultimately it's going to be for the best, I think there's, once the rule goes live, there's going to be some stumble steps out of the gate.
We always think like there's this perfect solution and the rule that we were very excited and we were hoping this rule would just add fuel to the fire, whatever descriptor you want to say. And I think it will, but to your point, it's not immediate. There's going to be a bit of friction as we start to really understand how to apply the rule. And certainly we're going through the comment period. I think we have until October 31st to finish comment, and then that starts a countdown for them. Oh, go, Rob. Help inform us.
The date is October 6th. So your comments have to be in by October 6th. You can do that online. You can mail it or fax it if you're really living in the 80s, I guess. And so October 6th is the date, and definitely if I'm sure you're going to say it at some point, but I would encourage everybody to have a look at what this rule is. Consult with other folks that are reading it and interpreting different pieces of it, and kind of come to your own opinion to see how this makes sense for your operations as you consider beyond visual line of sight moving forward.
Yeah, no, that's a great comment, Rob, because it's important that everyone have a fair opportunity to say, hey, these are the things that I like. These are the things that might be a friction point for me and for my operations. And these are things I'd like added to it. And everyone should have an opportunity to say that. And it's not going to be a perfect rule when it does come out finished. It's not going to meet every operator's checklist of things that they wanted and things that made sense. It's going to be the best that they can do with all the various operators and input that they receive over this next few weeks. And then Rob, once that comment period ends, how long do they have until they can finalize this rule? It's a trick question.
Yeah. So if you look at the executive order that was published in early June, the final rule is supposed to be published by February of 2026. That's kind of the official answer, I suppose. But then again, if you look at the executive order, it also called for the NPRM to be out by early July, and we didn't get it until last week. So take that information for what you will. My projection is that, it would be nice to see it in 2026, but I'll be happy if it gets there by 2027.
For viewers or listeners who aren't used to NPRMs and the rulemaking process, these are very short timetables. I mean, the administrative act that allows for the 60-day comment period and then rulemaking, that's like for a very simple rule. For something this complex, to give you an idea, with 107, we had almost a 10-month comment period, and then the FAA had to painstakingly go through and respond to all of those, and then kind of justify why they did what they did. And so I don't envy them because now what we're having to do is we're having to push that set of comments into a smaller window, and they're going to be probably intense. to answer. And everybody's going to want something different. Every industry is going to want something different, and they have to justify that. And that's a challenge.
Yeah, it's just to kind of follow up on that, so the adjudication period of those comments, if it's designed as it is, you're talking about 4 months, which is, really short, as Alex indicated, for a simple rule, feasible. For the complexity of this rule, probably unlikely. And, what's going to happen is those different stakeholders, because you have people that are interested in it from across the spectrum. So there's definitely some elements of the rule that seem like they're really well tailored for, delivery operations, right? And so those delivery operations, that kind of slant, is probably going to leave folks like that, the people that we work with that are kind of in the utility inspection space. There's some extra overhead that's not, that is not really required in our space, that we're probably going to be putting comments about, some proposals about how you might make that for the final rule adjustment. And so, it's really complicated.
We're kind of a victim of our own desires, because we've been arguing as an industry, where's our rule? Make it fast. It's been 5 years since 107, and then the executive administration jumps on board and says, do it. And everybody gets into a room together to do it quickly. And this is what happens. And now we kind of say, wait, this is a little too quick, maybe. So
I think the good news is, and again, to your point, I know all of us were hoping and praying. Again, it was a decade, between, Part 107 rule, and then, we've got an NPRM for 108. I think to really put that into perspective, and I always use kind of the analogy of aviation, right? So 1903, you had sustained flight, and then 1960s, you had space flight. So you look at that 60 years, a lot happened in aviation in 60 years, but then you look at kind of what's happening, 120 plus years of aviation, and you look at the drone industry and its advancement, again, to I think everyone's point on here is no rule's perfect, but our ability to now pontificate and comment on a rule that's out there, although probably not perfect for every industry cluster, our hope is through commentary, we can craft a more perfect, and then that would be probably the biggest advice from a commenting perspective, is there are plenty of things that we're going to be able to constructively criticize, but I think constructive is key, because we're basically saying, hey, this is not good for a lot of people, both financially, both operationally. But if you did X, Y, Z, this would now open up a more compliance-based rule that is good for more than just, package delivery or just surveying or for public safety. I think there's a lot of aspects of this rule that, again, a lot of times we're looking at the drone industry and we're saying, hey, it's the drone industry, kind of like saying, hey, it's the airline industry, but when we look at it, it's a lot like aviation, that it's like hot air balloons compared to like charter jet air to ag spraying to banner towing. It's all sorts of aspects of operations and different types of technologies under one regulatory umbrella. And so there's going to be a lot of changes, I think, that we will see as part of the final rule. But that's why it's so important now to craft those comments in a way that says, hey, these are issues, but here are recommendations grounded in aviation safety practices that can constructively give ideas for change.
You said something that was interesting, though, from Orville and Wilbur to maybe we landed on the moon. We're not sure. I'm kidding, Buzz. Don't
different
come after
podcast.
us. It's a joke. Yeah. Overviewing the 108, what it did, it broke it down to kind of like 4 big buckets for our viewers. It's the operational framework, or risk and tiers, or categories, if you will, with permitting and certification being 2 different things. And again, we won't be able to get into all these details on this podcast, but we'll kind of lay the groundwork and unpack it just a little bit here. And as we continue the discussion, we'll talk about maybe a little bit of each of these buckets. There's also the operator qualifications, and I want to use those air quotes because they talk about specific training, but there's no real licensure or certification attached to that. And I know internally we have some questions as aviators of well, how do we hold responsible the individuals who are responsible, you know? And so it's a kind of a weird dynamic on how we're going to do that. And again, we'll try to think about that today. And then we have that technology and performance where we talk about DAA, C2 link reliability, and some other contingency operations that they bucketize. And then finally, those procedures and documentation requirements, which are quite robust in their ask. And generally speaking, most operators will have this amount of data. It's just a matter of how do they maintain it and manage it and document in a recallable way, because essentially the FAA says they want to come and see any documents that you have that are required to be maintained at any time. And so there's some weirdness in there to unpack. Quickly, did I miss anything from the high level buckets from this team that might want to add to context there?
Did you mention UTM? I may have missed it. The detect and avoid UTM. 46?
Yeah, that's bucketized in that technology and performance kind of category. But yeah, that's another great call out. Is essentially the FAA is saying that in order to have this rule work, you need to have a UTM system, or a system that acts as the FAA controller for these autonomous or mostly autonomous vehicles, and a detect and avoid system that allows the vehicle to autonomously see traffic and avoid traffic when necessary. So those are some interesting technology requirements that are baked into here. But going into that kind of comment or that topic, I'd like to ask Rob, from your company standpoint, which DAA metrics or performance requirements are you seeing as maybe having the most consequential impact on the BVLOS capabilities? Is it like alerting timelines, possibility to intercept, or what do you see here as complexity in those requirements that are baked in that technology bucket?
It's kind of an ongoing complexity. The reality is detect and avoid technology has been in evolution for many years now. The challenge for DAA tech on the aircraft side is the size, weight, and power requirements to hold those types of equipment, and I think that is still certainly the initial read through the rule of the requirement for DAA seems to indicate that is going to be an ongoing requirement, and they don't specify specifically whether the DAA tech is going to be airborne or ground based. So I think that conversation about like how DAA is implemented is going to continue. We already have the conversation now under Part 107 or Part 91, and I think it's just going to continue under Part 108. So there are some right of way rule change proposals within the rule that I think that are going to loosen the burden in some places, but not quite to the extent where for most operations, you could run your aircraft with just an ADS-B in, and basically and it is spelled out in the rule that for certain operations that you can operate up to 400 feet, and you as the UA operator are required to still give way to crewed aircraft traffic that are broadcasting on ADS-B. So in those certain areas where, if the crewed aircraft is not broadcasting on ADS-B, that they will be required to give way to the unmanned aircraft. And that also, one thing I want to highlight here that is in this notice of proposed rulemaking. So, the big word is Part 108. So there's Part 108, but in addition to Part 108 in this NPRM is Part 146, which is the UTM requirement. And then there's also suggested changes to Part 91, Part 47, Part 133, Part 137, Part 135, Part 119, and there's a couple of others that I'm actually forgetting. But it's pretty comprehensive, because the reality is the implications of what's being proposed for this Part 108 and Part 146, impact those areas as well of traditional crewed aircraft operations. And so that's it's an interesting space. I think my only concern right now is that I feel like there could still be a bit more flexibility for having lower equipage requirements for DAA or airspace awareness, and I think there's still kind of this like kind of legacy reluctance from the crewed aircraft community to not equip with electronic conspicuity, even though it is proven to enhance airspace safety for everyone when
Yeah.
you're using those tools. So
Yeah, totally correct, and that's a good call out, because what I think about when you say that is DAA is actually kind of is an expensive endeavor. If you're a new OEM and you're trying to build this aircraft for BVLOS flight, you're going to have to start developing your DAA systems or lease them from somebody that has them or license them or something like that. It is probably much more expensive than requiring the GA aircraft to have ADS-B out. But yet they don't require the ADS-B out, and they say it's because it's a pricing thing. And to your point, Rob, I think peeling back that onion, I'm saying it's the price of doing business. You buy an airplane, you buy an ADS-B out.
Right.
I'll point out, the cost to equip an aircraft with an ADS-B, broadcast device is, probably in the noise compared to an annual inspection. Or if it's something like a hot air balloon that obviously doesn't have its own electronic capability, or you can have like kind of a system that can use work on that system as well. The cost to operate a hot air balloon is like hundreds of dollars an hour, right? So it's so in the grand scheme of things, the cost isn't the argument. It's not a viable argument.
The 108 does expect some BVLOS curricula and proficiency checks and some core modules. And so what do you think about that with regard to, what are you thinking for prioritization and building out these components? C2 link management, I think, is commented. Abnormal contingency ops is commented, and non-cooperative aircraft, traffic avoidance, kind of what Rob was talking about. What do you think? What do you think it looks like in the prioritization of revamping those curricula?
I'll take a little bit of issue with the revamping concept, because it will be new. It will be new. So what we've built already, it will exist, because 107 is not going away. So 107 is not going to go away. They still need to do things that they're doing. There's added curriculum or added modules that need to be taught. Obviously, the regulation itself they have to be compliant with. But in addition to that, we're going to have to focus more on automation management. We're going to have to focus on this conformity monitoring and planning. And so there's some real implications in the regulation about how we're going to plan for flights, how we're going to monitor the aircraft's ability to basically cooperate with the UTM, and then how we're going to deal with certain situations that could occur. I mean, lost link, for anybody who's operated UAS, that's just a part of life. Like, that happens all the time. You can almost not call it an abnormal situation because it's so normal. So how we're dealing with that. And every aircraft, at least the ones that I've flown, have different lost communication plans and things like that. And so it could be in the 107 world, where your visualized sight could be as simple as returning home. Well, now we have to worry about the ground risk, the ground track that we're going to be flying. So these are a lot of things that are not going to be dictated, definitely in that they're going to go under a topic header, but there's a lot of conformity standards that are going to have to come for what those individual topics mean. And so that part of it's going to be a big thing. The other thing is, I mentioned automation management. That's the way this regulation's laid out, with one-to-many, they specifically say we're not touching the controls, we're sitting back there, we're monitoring. This has a lot of automation. For those who study automation management, automation surprise, automation programming, there's trust issues. Then you have fatigue management. Sitting there watching 25 systems flying around, and then one thing goes wrong. We hope you're awake when that happens. So there's all these rules on flight duty days and things like that. And I would assume that that's part of the reason that's in there. But again, that's not going to work for everybody, because I can foresee a lot of different use cases where it's not just package delivery. You have the drone in a box concept where you're running a control center.
I was going to bring that exact one up, because there are scenarios where they have a controller in the control center hands-on, because they're trying to get more detailed in analysis or pictures, video, whatever sensor they're using, they need a maneuver to get more accuracy. I think the FAA would say that the waiver system and the waivers are not going away. They're just now transferring to 108 waivers, and that you'll have to ask for waiver from 108.
They kind of imply that that the waivers kind of are. I mean, they're not going to rely on it as much. But I agree. I see Rob wants to say something.
I know Rob's got something biting.
He's itching.
I'm going to say and it was actually Josh that pointed it out to me that where the proposed revisions to Part 107 in this NPRM are eliminating the ability to apply for waivers to BVLOS operations under Part 107.
Yeah.
You're right, but then it says that you must request relief under the 108 structure now. And so that's where I think they're leaving themselves a kind of back door, because they're just saying, hey, the 107 isn't going to be applicable, but now you just request your relief from 108 with this streamlined waiver process. And this might be one of those. You can't manipulate the controls. Well, there's very, very clear use cases where you need BVLOS. They can meet those rules, but they need to manipulate the controls.
And if we look at it compared to Part 107, again, we always explain 107 is kind of like that. It's a tool as part of your job. So if you're a lineman or you're a public safety officer or you're working in the tower industry, like if your job is XYZ and drones as a tool as a job, what 108's really kind of structured this as is you're operating out of a control station with the equipment that's being operated BVLOS. And so it is, I will say, a dynamic in terms of how drones are used today versus how 108's structuring them to be used as human over the loop, maybe in the loop, potentially from a human machine interface perspective. I think you could argue on both sides of the equation where the operational industry is going with drone technology, but it's very dependent upon the technology and the redundancies built into that technology to be safe in the national airspace. The human component of operations is there for supervisory, which is, again, this just highlighting it as a differential point, is very different than how Part 107 operations are operated today. So I think for a lot of corporations and the commercializing of Part 108, it is changing the business model for what drone operations will look like into the future.
One thing that's kind of mentioned very briefly in the section where they talk about the required knowledge is training for maintenance personnel and ground support personnel. But then if you go through the regulation, there are pretty intense requirements for maintenance, record keeping, inspection, things like that. So the training regime for technicians, which basically doesn't exist for right now on the 107 side, there's a whole new career here. And that career, and especially if you look to Josh's point, as we see automation increase and we see the one-to-many concept, we may have 2 or 3 flight coordinators, as they're called in the regulation, monitoring fleets of hundreds of aircraft. Well, how many technicians or ground crews is it going to take to service that same fleet? So we actually might see an inverse in the manning numbers, where we have less operators than we have technicians, especially in the drone in a box, like where they're basically saying, hey, drone 13A has gone offline, send a tech out to change out the parts. So new jobs, new careers that we have to look for.
And again, to throw in kind of like, where does that occur? Like that's always my big thing from a workforce perspective is, does that happen in 2 years, or does that 1 to 100 happen in 10 years, or does that end up way down the road because of what happens between now and then? And so that's the balancing act that I think the industry is going to be going through. Is I again, as a technician, like I love the technician aspect of this industry, but to Alex's point, the rules and requirements behind maintenance technician, because of the lack of definement in 108 and really hey, it's on you, the company, to ensure that this aircraft is maintained in a reliable way, and you're documenting that. They're putting a lot of the onus from proposed regulation, on the company to ensure the legitimacy of both their operation and the maintenance readiness of that technology, which it's new. It's not new to maybe an aviation company, but it will be new to a lot of companies that aren't or haven't operated in aviation before.
Yeah, and I mean, we've had some discussion on that, and we might be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. But speaking directly about the duty hour requirements that are in there, that might be a little restrictive to those, utility industries, and maybe they got to look at it differently. But they're certainly kind of not familiar with that standard duty day thought process that is baked into aviation over the many, many decades. To us as aviators, we're like, oh, that's a no brainer. But to the lineman who's using drone technology as a tool in the toolbox, it's foreign to them. And how do they apply those in a reasonable manner?
And it's already working a 50-hour work week. Like they're working 50
right.
hours. Their job.
Yeah.
Now we're saying do this job on top of it. They're like, I can't do less.
Josh, for you've developed, a robust education curriculum, and the ASTM has recognized that curriculum. And if you want to briefly speak on that, but really, how does this align, or what is USI doing to prepare and align for those requirements that are, although they may change, they are in the 108 NPRM and clearly kind of spelled out. How is USI preparing for that?
Yeah, and so this is kind of the exciting piece of again, USI 12 years into it. We did, to your point, go through an audit by ASTM to become an approved training provider of coursework that aligns to the industry consensus standards, so the personnel standard and the maintenance technician standard. And so the excitement as we look at 108 and some of the changes that Alex has highlighted earlier tied to job roles and functions, there are nuances, new things being brought through 108 with Part 146 UTM, from an educational requirement of how to operate the supervisory role from and again, from what we're reading is now it's not called this in the rules, but the pilot in command, basically the individual responsible for operations happening within the corporation. And so when you start to look at some of the changes happening, at the end of the day, it's going to come down to a shared safety culture. Again, you could have a flight coordinator as part of the role, but it's not a requirement. And so that flight supervisor is really the required position. So from a safety management perspective, USI has built a solid foundation. Again, it's premised on aviation safety foundations for educating both the technician, the operator, the coordinator, the supervisor. To Alex's point, there are some nuances tied to automation management, fatigue, automation dependency, like a lot of those topics and conversations very familiar to the aviation world that will have to be drawn in and applied to remotely operated aircraft specifically. But, what's really interesting is inside of the NPRM, training is mentioned 485 times throughout that document. And so when you look at how training is being structured under 108, it is very much under a certificate program. It needs to be an approved training program by the FAA. But under the permit, or the permitted operations side of Part 108, it's basically you need to have a training program. You need to have a training framework. And so what I'm excited about from a USI perspective is our whole mission statement is about empowering and enabling regional workforce development, which means that whether this is a corporation wanting to deploy a training program that meets all these requirements, and so they do that through train the trainer model, or if they want to leverage USI sites to do that training, that ecosystem already exists today. It's something we've been building for over a decade now. So my excitement, leading USI is that USI is well positioned to help support the workforce need of companies that want to deploy under this structure, but understanding both the aviation aspects of remotely piloted technology, the maintenance, the importance of maintenance, but also the rules that are tied to operations, which is like record keeping and pre-flight. These are things we've ingrained into that workforce through curriculum that we've been driving into this. Again, the general industry for over a decade is record keeping is part of the aviation umbrella. It's something that's familiar to aviation.
Yeah, and that goes back to what, again, we were talking about, those folks that weren't raised in aviation and educating them on those aviation skill sets and kind of the administrative tasks that go along with operating an aircraft in the national airspace. Rob or anyone, for extra credit, we've referred to these new operating rules a few times today, and maybe our viewers aren't completely familiar with them. Can you briefly, or anyone briefly, explain what these new roles are called and maybe what their equivalence is in aviation speak?
The main person, and basically where they put all the onus in Part 108, is somebody called the operations supervisor. And so the operations supervisor it's a unique role, I will say, in that it is like a pilot in command, but then it also has the some of the flavor of a director of operations under a Part 135. And what I mean by that is they have administrative duties, and they also have operational duties. Their operational duties are they're responsible for the safe execution of the operation and the flight, which would be traditionally a remote pilot in command responsibility. But the concept here is that they can, under this what they call one to many concept, you could have 25, 100 aircraft. Those numbers, I'm sure, will change a little bit. But whatever the company is capable of operating under this, that person's basically in charge of them all. And then they're going to have a second in command or a support role. And that support role is called flight coordinator. We've seen customers use different names for this, but the one that's for now, it's called as flight coordinator. And that person is basically monitoring the operation and making sure it is complying with the flight plan and the flight path, and monitoring the health and status of the aircraft. And so it also says in there that they'll do the pre-flight type stuff, and I wonder if that will be able to be separated out to ground crew, especially when you have something like an operations center. So you'll have one person in charge of the entire operation. You'll have people in charge of numerous aircraft, and that flight operations supervisor also has the requirement of training the personnel. And this is where we get kind of more into the organizational administration type stuff. They are responsible for the safety management system. So they really are, it's a pretty big job that in under Part 135, which is your on-demand air carriers, those positions actually have experience requirements and things like that. So
yeah, I was going to say
voluntary.
The director of operations for 135 or 121 is interviewed by the FAA to ensure that they meet that bar of required knowledge and skills in order to have that role and that position in that corporation or operations. So you're right. And here they're just kind of saying, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but they're saying it's up to the operator to define that and describe the meeting that bar for that role. So it's interesting.
But once they're in that position, if they leave, the permit or the operating certificate is dependent on it. So that's very much like a Part 135 or a 121, where it's, oh, your chief pilot left. You better identify who the next chief pilot is, and we need to find that out. So again, it's a higher level than a pilot in command normally would be. It's more responsibility than we would see normally. And then you have these coordinators that seem to be less. So I would almost equate them to like a second in command of a multi-crew aircraft. And then it just kind of briefly mentions you could have all these other positions. Like you could have a maintenance technician, you could have a ground handling crew, you could have people loading and unloading the aircraft. I'm sure there's more I'm missing, but
well, I think we talked about this a little earlier, how a lot of this structure came from more of that delivery based operations where they are, have these bespoke roles that are doing certain things that will help with efficiencies and safety and but not so much the actual safety of the flight operations as much as the efficiency and safety of maybe my ground operations and putting a package from the delivery area into the aircraft bay and launching it, et cetera, et cetera. And so trying to make sure that these descriptions fit such a broad industry as the drone industry with BVLOS capabilities, it seems very daunting. And I'm not certain that they've hit the nail on the head here. I feel like there's some context and some definition missing? Go ahead, Josh.
One last commentary, I think, for me on that point is it's like 135, but to your point, it's a lot broader and bigger. And so I always go back to like the underwriter, right? So who underwrites that risk? Like ultimately, pilot in command is the individual that's responsible. They are the pilot in command responsible, legally responsible for the safety of flight. Are we pulling that back to the supervisor role where they're now legally responsible for the safety of flight of all of those aircraft under their umbrella? And then it comes down to, so who's legally responsible? Is it the automation? Is it the supervisor? Is it the corporation? I think it creates a lot of ambiguity, which is going to have to be solved as part of the final rule.
And Rob, I was interested in hearing your take on and kind of shifting just a little bit here, though. But you had talked about the operational safety cases that we used to do or did under the 107 to get waivers. And there's still a requirement, though, to have like some hazard analysis and, contingency procedures spelled out. So like, what does that look like versus that narrative statement methodology in 107? Do you see changes in this new 108, and what is that going to mean to them?
I think the principle of it is no different, right? For what we were doing under Part 107 or the folks were doing under Part 91, the safety case requirement that the FAA has been evaluating is going to be the same. And so that functional hazard analysis that they've kind of outlined in what is required for Part 108 are the things that people have been doing kind of at an individual level all along. And so, and to that end, I think what's interesting is that, each of these permits and or certificates that an operator is going to apply for is going to require that, level of assessment. And so there's still going to be some individuality that's going to be at play for each of these 108 permits and certificates that gets issued, right? So it's not, so there's still a lot of elements of this that are still pretty individual, and so that's kind of, that is going to be kind of an ongoing point of complexity so it's not completely rule based in that regard. So that is an interesting aspect of this. So I think from our perspective, we will certainly align our safety cases the way that they are presented to be, in compliance with what 108 is looking for. But I don't think from our perspective, that's going to be a really heavy lift. One thing I just kind of back to the personnel qualifications there. It is really interesting because, you talk about the operational supervisor and the flight coordinators, and it also brings up M2N or one-to-many operations. And so, I've been with a working group with NASA for the past year or so, talking about end-to-end operations and some of the human factors considerations that need to go into that. And there's kind of an evolution going on in that space where the formulas aren't, M-to-N kind of implies a ratio, right? And so, and the ratio is probably not really the right way to look at it. It's more like it's a function, role fit, right? So, you might need to have an individual who's going to be monitoring the airspace, within a place where you're looking to operate, and another individual monitoring the health of the multiple systems that are operating, and then maybe another individual who's like kind of dedicated person that things get handed off to. And so, coming back to the other point Alex made earlier is about the automation, and specifically when you think about automation complacency, and really one of the bigger challenges in these kind of automated systems is basically assuring that people that are overwatching these systems don't get into a place where you need to have like the workloading of the individual set to a place where it's like, it's not too much, it's not too little, it's got to be just right, and it's just because it's a challenge. And I've been guilty of it myself. I mean, I've run a number of drone operations where the drone's just like doing its thing, great, you know what I mean? Like maybe I'm sidetracked, like, I don't know, like, reading an email or something like that. And then next thing you know, things start to go sideways. And then my reaction time is definitely a little longer because I was not, fully engaged in the operation. And so I certainly see as automation continues to become more commonplace, and particularly under this rule, that it's going to be a huge risk that needs to be addressed. So it's, I realize I went completely off bar from
No. This is good stuff. I think what's important to understand is for all of our viewers, there's people out there that are thinking these things, and they just want to hear from the industry experts like you three on what's going on. What does this really mean? Like, help me decipher this lingo, because aviation speak is its own language, and FAA speak is alien language. So we're trying to figure that out as a team and collaborate and discuss. So it's all right. And you did say something that was interesting. It piqued a kind of question in my head. Is there are also some more robust, although maybe not super clear requirements for, we talked about the recording and maintenance and airworthiness. Like, how do we approach that? And Rob, this is interesting for you, I think, because as a manufacturer, on a team that manufactures aircraft, component life limits and software version control and maintenance checks, like how do we structure that in the 108 for the day-to-day operator?
That is really challenging. For a small organization, that is developing aircraft, leveraging like effectively kind of COTS-based solutions in hardware and autopilot architecture. We're reliant on a lot of third-party resources to define what that is. And frankly, if we're buying like a motor from like T-Motor or some other type of organization, like some of that information is just simply not provided. So it is up for us as a manufacturer to make our best estimate as to what that might be. And it's not just Censys, right? So every UAS manufacturer is in the same boat where we're making limited quantities and we just haven't had the requirements to following traditional aviation practices, right? We're not building an aircraft that's type certificated, and it's and so we don't have kind of the overhead that those types of systems do. Well, rightfully so, should we, right? I mean, it's like this, the risk profile is significantly lower. So,
and you hit it right there. Was that if the FAA says you don't need to be type certified, then how can they say in the same manner, like, but you need to do all these things that normal type certified aircraft have to do? It's a little weird. And I don't think type certification for drone systems is the right answer, but I think there's a balance of what does the FAA really need to see and know, or be able to see and know, and what's not important. It also makes me think, so if they're trying to apply some of these fundamental aviation type things in the maintenance and record keeping, they're also trying to do it in the SMS, and Josh, you briefly spoke on that, and incident reporting and things of that nature, which I think USI has always prioritized in regard to our curriculum and what we deliver to students. But is there anything else we're going to do to take a different perspective or different approach with now having what looks like a requirement to have this robust SMS incident reporting data, type of training to everyone? Like we talked about the linemen, linemen used to just be able to take 107 and kind of go up there with the waivers covering them. But now it seems under 108 that lineman is going to have a robust set of education provided to them.
Yeah, no, you're hitting the nail on the head, because the reality is there's so much more to just the operation. Like before, it was, okay, you need to understand how to control the aircraft and get good data, right? And that's still very important. That's all part of the business model. But under 108, now it's a corporate liability. It's a corporate operation. We're now taking into account all of the additional, again, safety management system is kind of all the pieces and parts that go into a safe, reliable operation. So it's two sides of the coin. It's the safe, reliable side of the operation, but also the corporate company's ability to make money. It's the ROI. It's that make money, save money, or reduce hazard hours. And so when you look at kind of the impact to the operation, it's multiple pieces, everything from documentation to record keeping to company policy. So what are the standard operating procedures? What are the emergency response plans? What are the maintenance processes that are going to go into keeping these aircraft flying? On the other side of that, it's the operational practices. So if we look at like the pre-flighting in the processes that go into that, one of the call outs that I think is really interesting, and it's part of the waiver processes for 107 today, but are the categories of population density. And we had a conversation on this earlier this week on, it mentions Landscan as kind of that database of population densities. But I'm really interested in Rob's, because Rob's been obviously managing this on the waiver side from 107. But when you look at the operational complexities for 108 and Landscan kind of highlighting categories of population densities, Alex had highlighted that there's resolutions of population densities, and then there's also densities for day and night. And so there's all sorts of different data inside of Landscan in terms of what would constitute those categories. Rob, how do you see that impacting operations as the waivers are currently written, for clients today?
It basically kind of generifies the approach for doing BVLOS operations based on population density. And one of the things that we had done at Censys is that a number of the clients that we work with are utility customers, and they want to fly right-of-ways in places that have higher levels of population density. And so what we had done, we have an aircraft, we don't have a parachute, so this is in 05 specifically, doesn't have a parachute, doesn't have a certificate, it doesn't comply with the rule, rather, for operations over people, and it doesn't have a type certificate. And so we have an limited exposure of ops over people allowed for that aircraft and moving vehicles based on operational history, which is kind of following more like the exemption model that's defined under 44807. That's a whole another story. But what we've been able to do is get approvals that allow us to effectively ignore population density for restricted or limited access right-of-ways. And so from our perspective, the rule does not have that allowance. So that's certainly a comment that we are going to be making, is to capture that particular nuance of that type of an operation, and one that I think is really sensibly founded, right? They basically, even though if you're in an area where you have 2,500 or 3,000 people per square mile, you still have corridors that are just inherently unpopulated. And to that end, there's also, when you operate in higher population density areas, what isn't accounted for in tools like I don't believe Landscan has this, but like the fact that a number of people that in a population density calculation are inherently sheltered, like most of the time, right? They're inside a structure, and so it's a metric that I still think needs further refinement. I'm not quite sure how that works exactly. I know that there's been some models where some organizations are relying on anonymized cell phone data to kind of determine where people are, to kind of come up with dynamic population density numbers, and that could be the way forward. But again, I think there's it's a topic that I would love to see get looked at a little more closely than where it is currently posed.
I think one thing that's very interesting, and I mean, I understand they have to put a stake in the ground, and we have to all work off the same page. Which is important. So like cell phone data for one company, and then operational experience for another, that gets a little kind of hard for the administrator to regulate. My 2 points are is the ARC that came out, and when we looked at the operations over people, both were kind of looking at a model that was based off of kinetic energy. And when you look at the JARIS rule that Rob had mentioned, or the JARIS committee, when they look at ground risk, the ground risk is really associated with kinetic energy, right? And so, something like a parachute or something that reduces the amount of kinetic energy when something falls out of the sky onto a person, or a shelter that shields you from the kinetic energy. These are the kind of factors that you would say, oh, well, that really makes sense for population areas, not just a raw population number. And so like that part, I look at that. And then the other thing is having a common data source. For Part 107, the FAA runs a GIS. They have all the facility maps. There's an enormous amount of information and data out there that's geographic information that comes off of the servers of the FAA. And now we're going to go to Oak Ridge and get a different data source. And so now you have multiple data streams. That's all a complication. And so I would assume there's going to be a lot of comments on this specific part of it, because it also really discriminates against different types of operations with the gross way. It's an overly complicated, in my opinion, overly complicated mess. And that part probably is one of the few things I think needs to get fixed the most.
I agree. It's funny, as you're saying, like the impact energy, I'm imagining, because one of the things that I find fascinating about this proposed rule is the fact that it allows operations for aircraft up to 1,320 pounds.
Right.
I was like, in my mind, I was like 1320, 1320.
1320, yeah. Right. So it's like, you're kind of, obviously, the size of the aircraft and the impact energy, potential is going to be factored in there, but it's like, still, it's, the fact that you have an aircraft that weighs that much in the same category, something that weighs, 5 pounds is
Yeah.
kind of,
And I would argue there is a point of no return, and it's relatively small, meaning like something 55 pounds in the air is dangerous if it falls out of the air. And anything over that, it's not more dangerous. It's just dangerous. So yeah. So we're
although they said, sorry, Matt, the 1320, I think it was, if I'm remembering the reg right, it's for agricultural operations, and it's like category 3. So they're going to allow, full of pesticides, 1,320 pounds of aircraft flying over a more populated area than we can train on the Censys aircraft, for instance, or do flight tests. So you're like, that doesn't make any sense. So like I said, I think this is a point of contention going for the review period.
So, we wanted to keep this short and just kind of touch on a bunch of topics and different things for our audience, and just let you who are watching know that we are collaborating again, the training companies with the OEMs, with the delivery companies even, and we are discussing the rule and trying to make it make sense as best possible universally. So what is it that some of you should do? Well, start building your competencies now. Start reading the NPRM as much as you can. Start understanding what DAA means, how to incorporate it into your operations. Start understanding and thinking about C2 fundamentals. Start documenting your ops and your maintenance, because if you can start those good habits today, in a year or whatever, when 108 is actually published, it will be a smooth compliance or transition into that 108 compliance, because you're already documenting your stuff today. Again, I would say collaborate with some training providers and manufacturers. USI is happy to be a collaborator with Censys, and that's why we're fortunate enough to have Rob here today to talk to us from their perspective about the 108. And then finally, comment on the 108 clearly on how it affects you, and comment with a suggestion. If you can say, hey, this is affecting me and my operations, but I think we should do X, Y, and Z, that helps the regulator think about it and have a good conversation on what should happen next. So what we'll do here in closing, one last commentary. The overall theme of the 108 is self-regulation, it seems like. And self-regulation has not always had a good track record. The banking industry had self-regulation, and it was a terrible idea. The housing industry had some self-regulation. It was a terrible idea. And we have since fixed some of those as best we could, but they needed to be fixed. Aviation went from regulation to deregulation, and it has worked out relatively okay. I mean, the pocketbooks are being affected less, and we have had a safe track record. However, we have also seen gaps in that self-regulation through recent incidents with the MAX and some others. So needless to say, this seems to be maybe a potential for a combination of a little bit of that regulation and a little bit of the self-regulation, but there needs to be a good balance there. Currently in the world that Matt looks at, we're a little too far on that self-regulation side of the house, but that's just me only speaking for myself. And I will finish with the question that you guys get to comment on. This is, if part 108 is done right, in 24 months, we will see what? And we'll start with Josh.
In 24 months, if done right, we will see widespread adoption and scale of remotely piloted technologies to find that commercial case. We see it today, but 24 months from now, we should be seeing adoption, maybe not full-fledged scalability, but we'll start seeing widespread adoption of technologies for that corporate use case.
24 months down the road, again, I think if it's done correctly, there'll be a clear path for newer entrants and certainly existing operators to continue their BVLOS operations in a way that is repeatable and kind of equitable for all entities that are looking to get into that space.
I get to be the pessimistic one, I guess. So, all right, if done correctly, here's my crystal ball. If I was projecting the future, kind of deal, I think the package delivery companies, which have obviously had a pretty heavy hand in the crafting of this, will be the clear winners in 24 months. They will continue to scale their operation, and they'll probably start to see some kind of economic value in UAS, because right now they're burning money. And so if done right, they could do that. I think you'll start to see technologies that those companies are relying on for things like UTM to scale in certain metro areas so I think you're basically going to see your early adopters lead the technology revolution, and the technology revolution will scale in places where it makes financial sense, or at least they think there's a business case for that group. And the rest of us will be trying to make that regulation and that equipment work for those other industry needs.
Well, that's not 108 done right.
No, well, here's why I say done right, because there are still, just to get that done, there are so many moving parts that have to all come together within a 24-month period just to get that done. And so I think that is a realistic prediction of where the future. And it could be, Rob's point earlier, we could still be waiting on on the regulation to finalize. I hope not. I'm hoping for 12 months on that, and then the next year those early adopters.
Hey, this is a good time. Thank you, Rob, for your time. Thanks, Alex and Josh. I think we're excited. We actually have something tangible to look at now. It's been really, really long time. We've been waiting for this. We now have it. There's goods. There's needs improvements. And I think we're just continue working as a collaborative industry to make it better, hopefully. And then when it's published, like you said, Alex, we're going to work within it as published. And then hopefully we see this gasoline put to the industry like we talked about. Thank you again for your time. For those of you watching on YouTube, the NPRM docket will be in the information section, as well as a link there so you can read it and look at it and comment on your own with regard to the NPRM for part 108. It's been great. I appreciate your time. Thanks for watching today, and have a great day. Thanks again for joining us at the Unmanned Podcast powered by USI. I had a great time with all of our guests and hope you enjoyed the conversation, even if it was a bit longer than normal. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'll speak to you all again soon. Bye for now.